What I wanted to do in this opportunity is to have a conversation with you basically about some ideas I have about a subject which has been an interest of mine for some years now, which has to do with the theory of technique, of psychoanalytic technique, and deals with issues that concern the analyst more than the patient. Because over the years I've grown convinced that many of the patients that are difficult patients, yes, there is such a thing as difficult patients, but there is also something about the analytic work we do that creates the kind of difficulty some patients present, so that it seems to me that it was time to take some responsibility for some of the things we do, or could do, or might do, or shouldn't do. And in thinking about this, I became interested in the state of mind of the analyst, basically. And the state of mind of the analyst and the requirements for an analyst to work in a way that is perceptive, kind, receptive, intuitive, and so on. It's a long shopping list, and I'll be developing some ideas as we go along. And it's not a long paper. I'm going to read it from a text I have here, and then Hahn is going to be the discussant, as you know. Those of you who are involved in doing psychoanalytic work with patients discover very early in our training that we encounter many difficulties in relating to patients in a significant way, and that we find ourselves many times settling for the rhythm, depth, and style of work that falls within our comfort zone. Even with these attempts at self-preservation, we come across clinical issues that are built into the work itself and make us reconsider our analytic attitude. This is particularly evident when the use of projective identification makes it difficult or impossible for us to sustain the state of mind that is necessary to explore meaning in the transference situation. Unless, that is, we discover the particular tools that enable us to access our patient's unconscious in such a way as to create the closeness the analytic situation is meant to generate. It is those tools that are the focus of this paper. We are frequently recruited to join patients in acknowledging their state of mind, and we are sometimes induced to fall back on the more comforting approach of what Bjorn called knowing about something. The alternative is to be available to have the emotional experience communicated by the patient, which can only take place in the above-mentioned situation of closeness that is implied in the definition of intimacy. I'm personally inclined to think about these issues primarily from the point of view of our growth and development as psychoanalysts or psychotherapists, as I understand that the quality of our contact with our own psychic reality, unconscious processes, and self-analysis provides the mold within which we forge both the psychoanalytic process and character change in the patient. In order to address here some of the technical and personal elements that operate in all clinical encounters, I would like to start thinking with you about an early experience of intimacy between mother and baby, and what Bjorn called reverie. When talking about reverie, he was referring to a state of mind of the mother that is selflessly receptive to the baby's communications. And by transforming these communications through her responsive emotionality and understanding, by adding new meanings to these communications, she creates a state of reciprocal knowledge, whereby the baby becomes aware of the developing relationship between himself and his mother. It is frequently said that the analytic activity is comparable to the maternal reverie, but it seemed to me that there are some important differences between mothering and the effects on the analyst of the patient's communication. It is important to remember that the analytic situation is unique, and it is not meant to be a parent-child relationship. In the transference, we can be seen as mother, father, good, bad, or representing parts of the patient's self. And while preverbal messages can be picked up and processed, there is a parallel activity in analysis that allows the analyst to observe both his and his patient's responses in the here and now. Keeping an open and unbiased mind about what we observe, we are drawn, as we should be, to the extraordinary magnetic field created by the transference, so that it comes to dominate our attention and interest. That said, similarities between the mother-baby relationship and the analyst-patient relationship do exist. According to Klein theory, both operate with the use of projective identification, which plays a fundamental role in allowing the mother analyst to recognize and know the content of her baby or our patient's affect. These communications take place through projective identification and play a fundamental role in projecting states of mind that allow the mother to recognize and know the content of her baby's feelings. Some of you will know and understand the concept of projective identification intimately. For those of you who don't, let me just briefly define it. Projective identification has been written about extensively and was defined by Melanie Klein in 1946 in a paper called Notes on Some Schizoid Mechanisms, as an unconscious fantasy that entails a belief that it is possible to split off and project unwanted or troublesome parts of the self into external objects with the aim of affecting the object. Klein recognized that in doing so, the self suffers a sense of depletion and weakening, and the development of identity and the perceptual capacities are significantly altered, which result in depersonalization and claustrophobia. For example, the projection of negative feelings born out of a sense of failure often lead to major difficulties in an analysis when the patient feels that the evidence of his improvement is due to his omnipotent control of the analyst. Here the experience of improvement triggers envy and ingratitude that takes the form of an omnipotent fantasy that the improvement is generated by the patient himself through control of the analyst. As a consequence, it is now the analyst who experiences a sense of failure. Wilfred Bion and Donald Meltzer have developed a study of differentiation between what they call the communicative use of projective identification, as I described as a process between babies and mothers, and a more intrusive type of projective identification, which is at the core of various pathology, and is used as an omnipotent form of evacuation of psychic pain. It is the analyst's brief to be able to discriminate between these two types of projective identification, because communicative projective identification is basically meant to relate to an object, and is inspired by the interest and curiosity about the object, and as an expression of the epistemophilic instinct. Whereas intrusive identification is quite different in feeling, intentionality, and meaning. Meltzer prefers to call this latter type intrusive identification, because of the compulsion to affect the object through the omnipotent discharge of mental distress, the consequence of which is, as mentioned before, the altered perception of the object and the disturbances in identity. The state of free-floating attention in the analyst allows him to make a differentiation between these two forms of communication, both through the self-knowledge acquired in his analysis and his exposure to various transference situations counted in his practice. This allows him to navigate and preside over the analytic situations with empathy and receptivity. Ultimately, it is the interpretation as a verbal expression that adds meaning and becomes mutative, as suggested by Strachey. Interpretation, this new idea, as Bion called it, allows us to differentiate between the two types of interpretation. One, what you might call an exploratory interpretation, and interpretation proper. Exploration allows monitoring, developing, and deepening of the transference, while the interpretation proper is a metapsychological statement with genetic, dynamic, structural, and economic aspects of the transference. This interpretation proper modulates the patient's psychic pain and affects the object relations in his internal world, promoting what is usually referred to as psychic change. I would now like to turn my attention to the delicate process that ensues in the analyst's mind and leads up to the creation of an interpretation. In order to do this, I would like to focus on the analyst's receptivity as a quality of the mind, which has a fundamental influence on the creation of meaning in psychoanalytic work. I believe that what we bring to the sessions as part of our equipment is not only theories, ours or those of our supervisors, not only our identification with transference-bearing figures like our analysts, not only our goodwill and intentionality. We also bring very personal characteristics which I think deserve careful scrutiny. To mention a few. Negative capability, which is the capacity to work in a state of not knowing and confusion. Our relation to our internal objects, that is, introjected objects that populate our internal world. Our analytic attitude, that is, the neutral and kindly observation of the transference and counter-transference situation as part of the analysis, to fully engage in the process, which is likely to become a situation of learning and growth for both members of the dialogue. I repeat, for both members of the dialogue. Binocular vision, which is the ability to switch from one point of view to another in relation to something that is taking place, like being able to see simultaneously our patients and our own unconscious responses, which is instrumental in facilitating the recognition of the reversible perspective, which is an interesting state of mind that allows us to see alternative points of view of observations, interpretations, and the whole of an analysis, in contrast to a pathological situation in which, for example, the patient is only able to remain with one fixed perspective. These issues I just mentioned have been brilliantly described by Bion in his earlier books, and I mention them here because I want to convey to you the intricate and complex operation that takes place in the process of establishing an emotional engagement with patients. I would also want at this point to add some personal qualities of mine that I feel improve the analyst's sensitivity and stamina. Our own threshold for psychic pain, which plays a vital role in what we understand and how much anxiety we are able to process, which is what defines our containing capacity. Our capacity for linguistic precision that allows us to be unequivocal about the things we describe. An ever-present interest in what is implied more than in what is actually said. Observation of the not always subtle shifts we witness in patients who replace the development of knowledge from experience with intellectualized insight or adaptive behavior. Our capacity to relate intuitively to the patient. Our familiarity with the language of the unconscious and a certain ability to communicate our observations regarding the discrimination between state of mind and our own imaginative conjecture. Long list. But I would like to stress here that the most important ingredient in the analyst receptivity, that is intuition, which is the capacity to observe and recognize the presence of part or whole objects and repress displaced, denied, and censored fantasies. And this usually takes the form of an awareness of the change in the quality of our attention when we hear a communication that resonates in our unconscious and operates as a building block for further exploration. Here is a recent example. The patient is a young man who had been talking about, quite emphatically, about his resistance to marry his long-standing girlfriend, as he does, the reluctance which extended to the idea of having children. He was adamant about his determination, but in the last few months, through various rationalizations, came to regard both marriage and having children a possibility. Nothing has been decided to be clarified. It is a possibility. And in the course of a session after the last summer holiday, he told me that he had been woken up by howling noises coming from the rear garden. And when he looked out of the window, he saw, sitting in a circle, a family of foxes, 2 adult foxes making howling noises as if having a conversation, and 4 cub foxes looking up at the parents. My patient and his girlfriend watched the whole family, both fascinated and a bit afraid. And in listening to this description, I was struck not only by the observation of the primal scene, like the wolfman, you remember, but also by something that came to my mind in connection to his determination to have or not have children. The question was not would he, but could he. And wasn't the fascination with the primal scene covering up an anxiety about his fertility, a subject that was never mentioned in his analysis? I thought this idea was worth our exploring, and I suggested to my patient that his slight fear in observing this couple was linked with his fear and doubts about his own fertility and a sense of inferiority he might feel vis-a-vis the parental intercourse. He did hear about parental intercourse before this opportunity, and I think he knew what we were talking about. The link made to the transference situation regarding his experience to the analytic holiday led my patient to say that in fact he had been talking about precisely this with his girlfriend the night before, and my interpretation made him feel that I was present in that conversation. How did you know? I see intuition, therefore, as a precursor of empathy and as a function of the countertransference that we acquire through introjective identification with our own good objects. This process is important because it also allows us to recognize the symbolic significance and meaning in our response to the patient's state of mind. Well, what I want to do now is describe how I see the actual operation of the analytic encounter in the context where our only source of evidence are, say, dreams, the transference with its unconscious fantasies, and the behavior in the here and now of the session. When a patient relates a dream, an event, a memory, or a fantasy, we will be listening in such a way that we may go from incomprehension, not knowing, and even confusion to slowly having a mental representation accompanied by an affect. This often takes the form of an image, memory, or a fantasy of our own, which has an impact not only because of the projective element that is used in the patient communication, but also because we are processing this communication so as to find a meaning in the context of a particular transcript. We still do not know what things are about, but we are aware that we are having a response that requires self-analysis, in which not only do we have to separate the elements of our own unconscious from those belonging to the patient, but we also have to create a mutative transformation. Allowing ourselves to intuit the presence of the patient's object in our mind provides us with the most personal and sensitive contribution. It enables us to develop different qualities of empathy towards the patient's state of mind that leads to the possibility of generating the meaning I was mentioning earlier. Any hermeneutical activity depends on understanding, remaining open-ended, thus inviting further investigation of new variables, which in turn influence the receptive capability of the analyst, and allows him to modify the quality of his attention and therefore of his intuitive responsiveness. We are still on the road to understanding in an atmosphere of emotional insecurity. We are likely to feel the pressure to come up with a formulation for ourselves that is based on decoding our observation, so we can construct a working hypothesis called interpretation, which can be communicated to the patient. My personal view of the function of an interpretation is that it should not be part of our attempt to modify symptoms, provide reassurance, or rephrase the patient's free association. I would go so far as to suggest that in themselves, interpretations might not be meant to provide insight, but that the emergence of the experience of insight depends on the significance the analyst has for the patient at any given moment, and his admiration for the analyst's capacity to recognize and respond to his emotional state. I think of this as an aesthetic recognition of the analyst's intuitive receptivity, as well as a shift from attention to understanding as a response to an emotional state. This understanding is not meant to saturate the need for knowledge and generate perhaps more questions than it provides answers. The acquisition of self-knowledge will eventually create a sense of internal change, in which psychic reality will find a new expression in the transference relationship. I would also like to mention here another issue that stands out in every clinical account one hears, and in particular is particularly conspicuous in supervision. I'm referring here to the language of interpretation. Donald Meltzer, in his paper on the limits of language in 86, leans on Wittgenstein to put forward the important idea that some patients have difficulty in defining the limits between what cannot be said and what can only be shown. In applying this to the psychoanalyst activity, and provided we can say exactly what we mean with authenticity and sincerity, interpretations bridge the space between the two minds and create a new space in which intimacy can prosper. On the other hand, when there is no authenticity and sincerity, language becomes imprecise, and when feelings cannot find expression in words, they cry out for action, as in acting out, which can be sexualizing, reassuring, misunderstanding, denying of the negative contrasting, disrupting the analytic frame, and reinforcing self-idealization. I'm talking about the analyst. Meltzer says, unlike any other human relationship, The analytical method requires of the patient and analyst that action be suspended in favor of communication. Intimacy cannot, therefore, be manifest and indeed deepened by processes of showing one's feelings, but only through verbalizing them. I find it helpful to consider the ways in which our respective trainings equip us to work in an intuitive and imaginative way, and how we might be encouraged or discouraged from doing so. It seems to me that the complementarity of the psychoanalytic situation that had as an aim to promote intimacy has to be contrasted with a kind of pseudo-complementarity in which rapport, synchronicity, and emotional reverberation of the analyst in the presence of the patient needs, or the patient's needs, are transformed into an easy form of understanding. More specifically, I have in mind vague interpretations and those that are not oriented towards the patient's immediate anxiety. One version of this is an insistence on formulaic interpretations, be envy, separations, Oedipal strife, etc. In consequence, we are also in danger of being insensitive to the patient's criticisms, subject to a type of thinking that is non-thinking. The analyst is unaware that they are being repeatedly called up in a collusive relationship. The hallmark of this process, and what one can observe in a clinical situation, is the creation of certainties, simple-minded formulations, and poor emotional commitment. Thank you.
Our discussant is Kaplan. I want to especially thank Anne because she's the person at our institute who's most knowledgeable about Kleinian analysis. And I've learned so much from her over the years. She frequently has given seminars and spoken and so on. I haven't been able to take a course with her, but maybe I should, because faculty are allowed to take courses. But I have learned so much from her, and I really thank her. I can't say she's converted me into being a Kleinian, but I do think it's influenced my work in a lot of positive ways, what I've learned from her. Anne is a member of the Chicago Psychoanalytic Society and also a faculty member of the Institute. At the Institute, she's chair of the Child Analysis Committee, and she also teaches the history of psychoanalysis and, of course, on object relations theories, with an emphasis on Kleinian theory. She trained in child analysis at the Tavistock in London. And she's maintained strong ties with the Kleinians of London and has known Dr. Hahn over the years. And it's thanks to her that we were able to bring Dr. Hahn to Chicago. So our discussant, Anne Kaplan.
There's much too much for me to attend to in this paper, little jewels strewn throughout the paper. I've decided that what makes most sense for me to do as the discussant this evening is to pick up on some of these jewels, look at them closely, and make sure I understand, and hopefully to make sure that you understand the central ideas that he is conveying. And then I will start the conversation myself with Dr. Hahn about a few of the ideas that I find most intriguing. So for purposes of this discussion, I'm going to start with the title of Dr. Hahn's paper, The Analyst State of Mind and Growth in the Psychoanalytic Process. So he is telling us from the beginning that he will describe his thoughts on three aspects of our shared psychoanalytic universe: the analyst state of mind, growth, and the process. All three of these are, of course, large topics, each with a huge literature of its own. Tonight, we've had the opportunity to hear one London analyst's views on three subjects about which we all care deeply. Some of what Dr. Hahn says is probably familiar to you, some perhaps less familiar because he works in a different context, and some of it I think is quite new and original. I'm going to start with Dr. Hahn's formulation of the psychoanalytical process. What is it? What moves it forward? What is the patient's contribution? What is the analyst's contribution? He tells us that we first of all focus on the magnetic force field of the transference. And then he tells us the patient communicates with us via dreams, stories, memories, but most particularly in this paper via projective identification. By this he means that the patient, in some ways in parallel with the baby, stirs up in us emotions about which the baby or the patient cannot think. And it is our job to receive these projections, think about them, and give them back to the patient in a way that he can recognize something new that he hadn't previously been able to think about. Dr. Hahn differentiates for us between two kinds of projective identification. One he calls communicative, and the other intrusive identification. He implies that the first kind, communicative projective identification, which is based in the patient's curiosity and epistemophilia instinct, is much easier for the analyst to bear and think about. While the second kind, intrusive identification, in which the patient is trying to disown unwanted parts of himself, requires much more work for the analyst to bear. I will ask him later to help us understand how we'll know the one from the other. But just for the moment, let's leave this as the aspect of the patient's contribution to the analytic process that Dr. Hahn has focused on this evening. Now, from the point of view of the analyst's contribution to the psychoanalytic process, Dr. Hahn uses words we all know, but find difficult to define: receptivity, containment, intuition, empathy, interpretation. I suppose that is as good a description of the analytic process from the analyst's point of view as anything. First we perceive, then we contain, then we intuit, then we empathize, and then we interpret. Sounds easy when you put it like that, right? Now, you all will know that much has been written across the last 125 years on most of these terms. Everybody writes about containment these days. Empathy has been written about by all our forebears, from Freud to Ferenczi to Reich to Benešov to Kohut, among many others. Dr. Hahn's particular interest here is in two of these five aspects of psychoanalytic process: intuition and interpretation. Intuition is, of course, a hard concept to pin down. We understand it intuitively. As you know, Dr. Hahn comes out of a tradition that moves from Klein to Bion and Nelson. I thought it might be helpful to give you a few quotes from them on the subject of intuition. In Attention and Interpretation, Bion in 1970 wrote, "The physician is dependent on the realization of sensuous experience. In contrast with the psychoanalyst, whose dependence is on experience that is not sensuous. The physician can see and touch and smell. The realizations with which a psychoanalyst deals cannot be seen or touched. Anxiety has no shape, color, smell, or sound. For convenience, I, this is Dion, propose to use the term intuit as a parallel in the psychoanalyst domain to the physician's use of see, touch, smell, and hear. So that's beyond intuition. Meltzer also uses the word intuition as, for example, in describing the process of coming to a dream interpretation. He says, in this method, we operate with intuitive insights supervised by scientific, conscious modes of observation and thought. This artistic activity is rich enough in its potentialities to allow for the possibility of inspiration and great beauty to emerge. So according to Meltzer, we are in the realm of artistic activity. Dr. Hahn defines intuition as, quote, a capacity to observe and recognize the presence of part or whole objects and repressed, displaced, denied, and censored fantasies. Later, he says, allowing ourselves to intuit the presence of the patient's objects in our mind enables us to develop different qualities of empathy toward the patient's state of mind and leads to the possibility of generating a meaning. I think we all know what he means, and we do use our intuition to assess at any given moment how deep is the patient's anxiety. Can we, in entrancements, be seen as a whole person with lives outside the consulting room? Or are we part objects whose independent existence can only be experienced as a catastrophe? We formulate our interventions taking some account of our patient's capacity to make use of our independent minds. Dr. Hahn gives us an example from his own practice of a young man who isn't just worried about whether he wants children, but on a deeper level, he's worried about whether he can have children. His fertility is at stake. Dr. Hahn intuited this from the patient's report of a middle-of-the-night experience with foxes. The patient confirms, I was just talking to my girlfriend about that last night. Were you there? Another example, this one from my own practice. Yesterday, I saw a 6-year-old boy who I now see 3 times a week. He begins every session by using every sheet of clean white paper I lay out for him, usually about 7 or 8. With the markers, he writes the names of subway stops, 1 name per page. Fullerton, Ashland, Belmont, Adams and Wabash, goes on and on. Now, sometimes these names have been elaborated into names for classmates, and he's the teacher. But recently, I've gotten impatient with what begins to seem mindless, repetitive, obsessional. Yesterday, I asked him what would happen if I didn't give him the clean new paper for every session. He looked distressed. He glanced anxiously at my yellow legal pad, clearly hoping that could still be his backup option. And then, perhaps a few seconds later, he stared off into the middle distance. In an eerie, otherworldly voice, he said, Mommy says that sharing is when you love someone. Now, he barely ever mentions his mom, never mind quoting her. Oh, I thought. My intuition filled in the blanks about what this white paper means to him. This little boy needs the white paper the way the baby needs the breast, the way the baby needs milk. Now I get it. Survival is at stake. So I'll keep providing the paper for the moment. Surely intuition belongs somewhere in a creative interchange with affections. Okay, the second aspect of the analyst's contribution to the psychoanalytic process that Dr. Hahn focuses on today is interpretation. Now, we all know the long conversation in the American psychoanalytic literature about curative factors in psychoanalysis. Is the main thing interpretation leading to insight, or is it the relationship? Or is it both in some interaction with each other? Here, Dr. Hahn has something particularly interesting and original to say. He says the main function of insight isn't so much increased knowledge about previously split off or repressed aspects of the self. Rather, the function of insight has something to do with the patient having an aesthetic experience while listening to how the analyst's mind works. The patient gradually introjects this capacity and can then work more imaginatively and what might say sympathetically with his own internal process. I'll say a little bit more about that later. Now, the second part of the title of Dr. Hahn's paper that I want to review with you is his description of the analyst's state of mind. He says the quality of our contact with our own psychic reality, unconscious processes, and self-analysis provides the mold within which we forge both the psychoanalytic process and character change in the patient. He further says that the analyst must preside over the proceedings with neutrality and benevolence as we aim to, quote, connect with the depth of the more sensitive, tender, and primitive parts of our patients. So what allows us to do this? Dr. Hahn lists a number of qualities. His list is extensive, impressive, and helpful, I think. Let me pick out a few of the attributes he lists. Negative capability, which you probably all know from John Keats's description of the poetic imagination, the capacity to be in uncertainty and doubt without irritably reaching after fact and reason. Okay, the second quality is our own threshold for psychic pain. Third is our relation to our own internal objects, which means our capacity to be in ongoing conversation with the creative aspects of our parents and teachers, while still maintaining our own voice. 4, our familiarity with the language of the unconscious and our linguistic precision in describing those languages. And 5, our capacity for flexible thinking, which Dr. Hahn calls after binocular vision and reversible perspective, meaning our capacity to see things from different perspectives at the same time. Now, this list is at the same time intimidating. Who can acquire all of that? And inspiring. At least we know the qualities to which we aspire. The third word Dr. Hahn uses in his title is growth. When I first saw this title, I was intrigued. Whose growth are we talking about? The patient's, the analyst's, And what kind of growth will we talk about? Dr. Hahn quickly shows us that our own growth as human beings is on the line with our patient's growth. He wants us to recognize the difference between quasi-analysis, based in imposterism, when we are going by the book, whatever book it is, or mouthing the words of our supervisors or teachers, versus times of authenticity and sincerity when real work is going on. He tells us of the importance of our personal involvement in the analytic work. Both, he says, both parties benefit in these exchanges. The analyst can use his internal resources to learn more about himself thanks to the patient, and the patient uses the quality of mind in the analyst as a model that, once introjected, will provide the backbone for his or her own further developmental strive. He has told us that the emergence of the experience of insight depends on an aesthetic recognition of the analyst's capacity to receive an emotional state and shift from attention to understanding. The patient's admiration for this quality of mind in his analyst gets gradually introjected, and this provides the backbone for further developmental strides. So what growth is Dr. Hahn here privileging? It is not symptom relief. It is not where it is, there shall evil be. It is not living happily ever after. Growth is here measured by the development of a backbone to go on working with oneself, whatever life may bring. Okay, so now I'd like to pose two questions to Dr. Hahn, just to get our discussion going. First, can you tell us how we can know from the inside the difference between communicative and intrusive identification? You say a bit in your paper about the experience of a patient who feels themselves to be a failure and who then somehow maneuvers things so he's a success and we're the failure. How does he do that? We know the feeling. The analysis, everything about us is failing this patient. What is the mechanism? And is that communicative or intrusive identification? Perhaps you could say a bit more about that.
Yes. Thank you. Yes, I think it's an important question, partly because it is an area that lends itself to confusion, in particular for those of us who are not comfortable working with our countertransference. But what isn't confusing for us is the experience of being exposed to an activity by the patient that creates something like an interference, something like a noise in the communication, something like a sense of cut-offness, something like a surge of feelings for the patient or against the patient, which in our experience cannot be transformed, cannot be digested in our countertransference. It seems to me that the experience of that kind of interaction that has the effect of affecting our attention, like for instance splitting, that affects our listening, our receptivity, that interferes with our intuition and that has a very concrete element in it, in the sense that these projections in intrusive identification are always felt to be concrete projections of something or other. In particular, it does seem to focus on events or internal experiences of the patient that are linked to a source of psychic pain. And it does seem to me that it is different from listening to a patient in pain, registering it, thinking about it, trying to give it some shape, trying to make it into a coherent proposal, come up with an interpretation from listening to a patient in pain and feeling flooded, paralyzed, and taken out of the equation. It does seem to me that the intrusive aspects that do precisely that intrude into the working of our mind and our goodwill sometimes is very clear. I'm sure that those of you who see patients have met a situation of the sort that is intrusive and that is sometimes manageable and many times isn't. When it is manageable, it does seem to me that there is a certain amount of work the analyst is capable of doing in spite of the injuries you may feel about an envious attack, for example. On the other hand, it does seem to me that carrying a sense of failure, believing it, and having one's own nightmares to digest it is very clearly the hallmark of being injected with something very toxic and something very destructive, and something that is confirmed by the patient suddenly changing his state of mind. And that after that attack, and we feel a bit burdened by the things he tried to get rid of, the patient feels improved, relief. That kind of relief seems to me to be relief for the wrong reasons, as it were. It seems to me that getting rid of things one doesn't want into an object, makes it more difficult for the object, but people do feel relief, and that is what they look for. It does seem to me that the acceptance of that kind of situation without an interpretation that clarifies that the price to be paid for feeling relief is to have the object deal with a situation that isn't theirs. Although they may, in their generosity, do that situation is likely to create, in the long run, the kind of depressive reaction in the patient that we all know will eventually catch up with them. I don't think so.
Thank you. My second question, or set of associations, are on the subject of intuition. Dr. Hahn is telling us that intuition is central to the analytic process. Can we really make any headway in describing this? Or is it fundamentally mysterious, more in the realm of the art than the craft of psychoanalysis? So I have two associations to the question about intuition. We Americans all know the famous quote from the Supreme Court Justice, we may not know this, Father Stewart in 1964, when he commented on the threshold test for pornography. Right? He said, "I shall not today attempt further to define the kinds of material I understand to be embraced within this concept, and perhaps I could never succeed in intelligently doing so, but I know it when I see it." That has come to be known as the "I know it when I see it" test. Is that the best we can do on the subject of intuition? Another association that came to my mind when I thought about intuition, just wanted to pass this as I cited above, Dr. Meltzer locates intuition in the realm of artistic activity, rich enough to allow for inspiration and great beauty to emerge. Now, this description of the nature of intuition reminds me of Stephen Dedalus' project at the end of Portrait of the Artist as a Companion. He, Stephen Dedalus, but obviously James Joyce, contemplates his future as an artist. In one day's diary entry, he writes, "I go to encounter for the millionth time the reality of experience and to forge in the smithy of my soul." For the next day, he writes, "Old Father, old artificer, stand me now and ever in good stead." I think the project for that young artist is also our project in our consulting group. In each new session, we try to encounter for the millionth time the reality of the patient and our own experience, and to forge in the smithy of our souls the uncreated conscience, not of our race, but of our patient's state of being on that particular day. And we also plead, not with old father, old artificer, but with our good objects now inside us, stand we now and ever in good stead. Anyway, perhaps you could comment a bit more on this elusive experience of intuition, or perhaps James Joyce has the last word on this subject.
Thank you, Anne. So thank you for the discussion. I feel very tempted to hand over to James Joyce. It seems to me that from our point of view, the subject of intuition is one which is mysterious and is likely to remain mysterious. It's something that we probably all know about because we use it in the right context in other occasions. And it seems to me that it isn't so much I know it when I see it, but I know it. But why don't I see it? In other words, why is it that we know something or we hear somebody presenting material and we can tell that they are in touch with a particular sentiment, with a particular way of dealing with symbols, that they are in touch with their own responses, and they come up with something that one has to question: is it wild analysis or is it creative genius? Is it an interference from the analyst's countertransference, or is it something that is done in depth that gives place to a thought or an association that is the missing link for relating the patient to the patient and opening up various avenues of exploration? It does seem to me that it is likely to remain mysterious. I think I feel very much like Bion suggests, that these are issues that have to do with analysis, analysts, not the patient. That these are issues that have to do with the development through experience, through emotional experience in the analysis of the patient. It's something that one can learn, something that one can develop. It does seem to me that the development, and that is why I was talking about the training, the development is something for which people need to be accompanied, chaperoned, monitored, helped, enlightened, and it does seem to me that working with in an intuitive way is, for some of us, one of the aims of being with a patient. One of the aims, not the only one. But the truth is that it is something that you cannot make happen. It is something that happens as a result of work, and when it happens, you recognize it, and you feel relieved that your intuition brings into the interaction with the patient part of the puzzle that fits quite neatly into a kind of developmental plan for further analysis. I hope I managed not to answer the question the way you expect.
Okay, so now we have a chance for all of you to get involved with interaction with you. Any questions, comments, or whatever you have. So who would like to start out? Leo.
I very much appreciated your list of the qualities, the capacities that the analyst needs to have. And you were talking about the education and development of analysts. And I'm thinking about very early young trainees. This may seem like an impossible question, but of your list of capacities, which of those do you think is the most important first one to try to cultivate in very early trainees?
The first one as a priority or developmentally?
I'm sorry, say that again?
What would be most important to develop if you had to pick one?
Say it again?
What would be most important to develop of those capacities if you had to pick one?
Is that the question, Rob?
Yeah. For very early training.
Yeah, observation.
Observation.
The capacity for observation. It does seem to me that whatever you do would be based on what you observe. And observation can be fostered, can be learned, or it can be pushed away and acted on. And it seems to me that the collection of information from the patient that takes the form of all sorts of things requires a state of mind in which observation, without intervention, without interference, is allowed to have its penetrating effect in our own sensitivity. And it does seem to me that this has been recognized in England, in London. The first thing candidates do, the first thing they do before they take patients is a year or two of observation of babies or small children. It does seem to me that that is definitely the most interesting thing in my first year before taking patients and supervising them. It does seem to me that it does create a kind of outlook as to what is important. The primary thing that you teach somebody is how to.
Okay.
Well, I always have plenty of questions, so I'll put in one of mine. Maybe somebody will think of something in the meanwhile. I was interested by your comment that many analysts get too wedded to a theoretical framework, and they sort of operate out of that framework and do what they think the framework says they're supposed to be doing, instead of having some kind of more authentic way of relating to their patients. Is that, well, and I wonder if you could elaborate on that, and in particular, if you think certain frameworks are more given to that? And are there any examples that might come to mind of how this is done? So the idea of an analyst operating on a theoretical framework instead of in a more authentic way.
Yeah. Let me quote what I said before, if I find it today. But I think the point I was trying to make is that given a situation of failure to understand, of failure to engage, or failure to find a meaning in themselves, that we become defensive, that we feel guilty, hopefully. We feel, it seems to me, a sense of owing something to the patient. It also makes us feel persecuted. And it does seem to me that the adherence to a theoretical framework, not the framework of the analysis, but a theoretical,
Yes.
a theory,
Yes.
is something that we shield behind to cover up those failures that are more guilt-inducing and more accusatory.
Do you feel that a variety of theoretical frameworks all can be used in that way?
I don't know about theoretical frameworks, I know about analysts. And I know that every analyst has his hobby horse. And some of these hobby horses can be used for play, some can be used for work, and some can be used as missiles. Yeah.
Okay. Yes. Take this. Eva.
Well, since Anne used James Joyce, and since we've been struggling to define intuition from inside in one's terms, I associated with Freud writing Arthur Schnitzler for his 50th birthday, in which he said, "You artists, you have insights and intuition of such deep thoughts, impulses, feelings, that we analysts have to struggle very hard and long with great difficulty to come to the same kind of conclusion."
Some thoughts about that? Anybody?
He was a flatterer.
He was a flatterer. Yeah, but he stated the same kind of thing at other times, Freud did, in a more personal way, not flattering somebody, but feeling that he felt humbled sometimes by seeing the understandings that Shakespeare, Dostoevsky, and Goethe, for example, had that were so hard-won for him to come to. Arnie?
Could we consider intuition from the point of view that the patient has things on the edge of his consciousness? And that what's crucial in analysis is to get a hold of those things, to help the patient learn how to be able to get a hold of things that are on the edges of his conscious mind. And that intuition might be only that which the patient has been trying to get to, and he is giving us now the responsibility, because we've taken that in a sense, of taking the patient into analysis, promising in a way that we will grasp those things which he is having trouble getting a hold of, that we'll do it for him, and that is a crucial part of treatment, because we all like to save energy and have someone else do it for us.
Thoughts?
Yes, I entirely agree with that. It seems to me that we're not discovering the wheel by having an intuition about the patient. We are just following the patient. It seems to me that things that are on the fringes are things that patients sometimes need a bit of help to get to. And we can do it by dreaming for them. We can do it by analyzing it, or we can do it by throwing out test interpretations until we get to the right wavelength, as it were. But I do agree with you entirely that this is something that can be done in the context of a relationship, and that there has to be a certain intimacy for us to be able to see beyond what the patient says. When I said before, to hear what happens to what is not said. And what is not said is usually what is in Freudian terms repressed, or in Kleinian terms projected or split off. And it seems to me that it does take the form of bits that require integration in the form of knowledge, in the form of information about the self, and in the form of a kind of recognition that that there is work in progress going on in both parties. In both parties. It does seem to me that the reassurance, the only reassurance that work with patients is the convincing experience of the analyst working. And I say that seriously, partly because it does seem to me that they are very sensitive to those times when we coast alone. For all the reasons.
Neil?
I was thinking about your list of qualities that I really like anytime somebody makes a list. We are so much more than our qualities, as enumerated. There's always something individual to each of us that I think can't be captured so easily. And you've spoken about the importance of intimacy in terms of establishing a analytic space that is going to be fruitful. And I was wondering, how does a person establish intimacy? That is there a place for openness, or some way of conceptualizing a willingness to be intimate that is not quite captured, or that needs to be captured in terms of thinking about technique? This is another thing like intuition that's very difficult, but I'm interested in your thoughts on that.
Yes. I think it is true for some that we are more than a group of requirements, as it were. And I prefer to think of this list, long list, as the tools in my toolbox, as instruments rather than they happen to be requirements for use by my personality or the analyst's listening capacity, or the problems with having a low threshold to pain when it comes to situations of mourning, for example. Things which are unfinished or unworked with and require attention. It does seem to me that we need tools, and we need tools to be fit to do the job they have to do. And it does seem to me that perhaps it would be more useful to portray it as, that this is what I have in my toolbox. What do you have in yours? And compare this for a discussion. I had something to say about the second part. I don't remember what it was. Yes, intimacy, of course.
Yeah.
Intimacy is was the subject of the international conference in Argentina last year. And there were about 1,000 analysts and 1,500 opinions about intimacy.
Sure.
Yes, you go from the Talmudic discussions about it to clinical examples that people fight over. But it does seem to me that that we value it as analysts. We value to create the conditions for there to be an exchange in the procedure. And we feel that the conditions that we tend to create, that is the abstinence, the rule of abstinence, the sticking to understanding and not acting out, the various things that we take for granted, are supposed to help the patient to regress to a position where he can still work, but comes in touch with primitive parts of himself or parts of himself that come up in the context of the current transplant situation. So it does seem to me that the notion of intimacy is something that lovers like and analysts need to do the work. And it does seem to me that it has to do with creating the conditions for intimacy, that all this work we do is relevant. It seems to me that it is intimacy from mind to mind. It is important because it is loaded with meaning, in that there are many relationships in which intimacy has been experienced, either those experiences that have been positive and those that haven't gone well. And you very quickly learn when you enter an area in which the patient has suffered abuse, intrusiveness, loss. In a situation of intimacy, it's always something that is tragic from the patient's point of view and relevant to understanding the patient. So I do think that intimacy is something we can work with, and that we do, whether we admit it or not, that is what we do. Once we accept that there is a setting, once we accept that there is an attitude, an analytic attitude, once we accept that there is an internal world, it's inevitable, it seems to me, to work in a context that one defines as intimacy. It's becoming more complicated now, it's not like intuition. But I do think that it is something one needs to create. Although Bjorn would say that we're not supposed to wish. Right?
Well, I think this is a signal that this might be a good time to stop. I thank Dr. Hahn and Dr. Kaplan for wonderful.